Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, night has completely swallowed the landscape. A heavy freight train moves through the black taiga, while outside the cab, the temperature has fallen to nearly minus 45 degrees Celsius. The cold is so intense that rubber becomes stiff like old plastic, and bare skin can freeze to exposed metal in seconds. Inside the locomotive cab, two men are working through the night. One is at the controls, watching the darkness ahead, where the headlights reveal only two narrow steel rails. Beside him, the second crew member leans back in his seat with his eyes closed, trying to steal a little sleep before his turn comes.
Behind a thin partition, the diesel engine continues to roar. It does not shut down at a station. It does not shut down at a siding. During the deepest part of winter, it may remain running even when the locomotive is standing still for hours. There may be no houses, no street lights, and no help for dozens or even hundreds of kilometers in any direction. The railway is isolated from the rest of the world, and if something goes wrong tonight, these two men will be the ones expected to deal with it.
But the cold has a very specific target. It is not the crew, at least not yet. It is not even the diesel engine itself. Its real danger spreads along the hundreds of meters of freight cars behind the locomotive. It attacks silently, hour after hour, without making a sound that the human ear can recognize. The engineers know this enemy very well, and almost everything they do during a winter shift is designed to keep it under control. Because if the cold wins at the wrong moment, thousands of tons of steel will discover the problem at the worst possible place, on a long downhill grade. Tonight, we are going to follow this crew through an entire winter shift, from the moment they receive their locomotive in the darkness of the afternoon until the first weak daylight appears over the terminal. We will see why the diesel cannot simply be switched off, how two people manage to rest inside a vibrating metal cab that never becomes silent, and why a train weighing thousands of tons is stopped not by a mechanical lever, but by changes in ordinary compressed air. We will also see what happens when that air begins to disappear at minus 45 degrees, with the nearest serious assistance far away. Before we climb into the cab, there is one important thing to understand. Working in this environment is not mainly about bravery. It is about procedure. In extreme cold, even a small shortcut can become a major problem several hours later. Every inspection, every pressure check, every decision about speed, and every moment of rest has a reason behind it. So, let us begin at the start of the shift, when the winter darkness has already arrived. It is around 4 in the afternoon. At this latitude, winter daylight disappears long before the working day is finished, so the crew begins its shift under artificial lights. Powerful lamps illuminate the station, while frozen mist hangs around locomotives that are already running. The engineer and his assistant receive the freight locomotive, but their work does not begin inside the cab. First, they walk around the machine with flashlights, inspecting everything they can reach. They check the running gear, brake components, connections, hoses between the cars, and other equipment that must function perfectly during the journey. At minus 45 degrees, ordinary materials behave differently. Rubber loses its flexibility and becomes stiff. Plastic becomes brittle. Metal pulls heat away from human fingers with frightening speed. A simple task that would take seconds in summer can become dangerous in winter. The crew works in short intervals, keeping their hands protected and warming them whenever necessary. Even the snow beneath their boots behaves differently. Instead of producing the familiar soft crunch, extremely cold snow can make a sharp, dry, squeaking sound, almost like breaking foam. The inspection, therefore, takes considerably longer than it would under normal conditions. There is no advantage in rushing. Anything missed beside the warm maintenance area may have to be discovered later in complete darkness, beside a train stretching hundreds of meters into the frozen wilderness. Once the outside inspection is complete, the crew enters the cab and receives the operating documents. They study the total weight of the train, the length of the consist, and the track profile ahead. They need to know where the steep climbs are,
where the long descents begin, and where the train will need to control its speed carefully. These numbers will determine many of their decisions during the night. And while the crew has been walking around the locomotive and completing paperwork, the diesel engine has continued running quietly at idle. A thick cloud of white exhaust rises into the frozen air. It may look wasteful to keep such a powerful engine running when the train is not moving, but in this environment, shutting it down can create a much more expensive problem. To understand why, we need to look at what happens to a diesel locomotive during a severe freeze. A locomotive diesel engine relies on a cooling system that circulates liquid through passages, pipes, pumps, and radiators. While the engine is operating, the coolant remains warm and continues moving through the system. If the engine is switched off in extreme cold, the temperature begins falling rapidly. Eventually, the liquid can freeze. Water expands as it turns into ice, and that expansion can exert tremendous force on pipes, radiators, pumps, and other components. A locomotive that was perfectly operational at the end of the previous shift can become seriously damaged after sitting cold through a severe winter night. Railway workers refer to this kind of damage as a freeze-up or thaw-related failure. The consequences can include cracked cooling passages, damaged radiator sections, failed pumps, and other expensive repairs. The batteries also suffer in extreme cold, losing a significant portion of their available capacity. Restarting a huge diesel engine after it has been allowed to become deeply frozen is therefore not a simple matter. The engine requires enormous starting power, while the batteries themselves are performing at their weakest. Sometimes the system can be restarted, but there is no guarantee. In an isolated region, taking that risk simply to save fuel makes little economic sense. The diesel running at idle is effectively insurance against a much more serious failure. Geography makes this decision even more important. The Alaska Railroad stretches for roughly 760 kilometers, connecting the southern coastal region through Anchorage with Fairbanks in the interior. Unlike many major railway systems, it does not connect directly to the continental North American rail network. There is no simple route allowing another locomotive to arrive quickly from a neighboring railway. Much of the surrounding territory consists of mountains, forests, and vast stretches of wilderness. Heavy railway equipment cannot simply be driven in from another nearby line. Locomotives, cars, replacement equipment, and other large machinery can require transportation through ports and other logistical routes. In many cases, that process can take a very long time. That changes the entire calculation. If a locomotive fails, the railroad cannot necessarily replace it tomorrow morning. A replacement machine may have to travel a great distance before it reaches the isolated railway. Every locomotive already available therefore becomes extremely valuable. Burning diesel fuel while the engine idles may cost money, but losing an operational locomotive because of freezing can cost far more. By early evening, the train is ready to leave the yard. The locomotive moves on to the main line, and its headlights carve two narrow paths through the darkness. On both sides, the forest appears almost completely black. At stations and switches, special heating systems help prevent equipment from freezing solid. But the railway has another winter problem that has nothing to do with machines. Moose frequently move onto railway tracks during winter. Deep snow can make walking through the forest exhausting, while the compacted surface of a railway can offer an easier path. When a large animal stands directly ahead of a freight train, the engineer has very limited options. A heavily loaded train cannot stop instantly. Thousands of tons of moving steel have enormous momentum. This leads to a question that most people never consider. How exactly does a locomotive crew stop a train that may stretch hundreds of meters behind them? The engineer cannot simply pull a cable connected to every brake shoe. There is no mechanical lever reaching all the way to the final car. Instead, the braking command travels through a system that runs almost the entire length of the train. The solution was developed more than a century ago and became one of the most important safety systems in railway history. Along the train runs a continuous brake pipe.
Each car is connected to the next using flexible hoses, creating one long pneumatic system from the locomotive to the final wagon. The locomotive compressor supplies compressed air, and that pressure controls the braking equipment throughout the train. Here is where railway braking becomes surprisingly counterintuitive. In many machines, applying pressure means applying force. But on a conventional freight train, full pressure in the brake pipe generally corresponds to released brakes. The train moves normally while the system is charged. When the engineer wants to slow down, the pressure in the brake pipe is reduced. That pressure reduction is detected by the control equipment on each freight car. The cars respond by applying their brakes. In other words, the train does not normally stop because the engineer mechanically pushes every brake into position. Instead, the engineer changes the pressure inside a long pneumatic communication line, and the individual cars respond to that change. The reason for this apparently backwards design is one of the most important safety principles in railway engineering. Imagine that a train breaks apart while moving. A coupling fails, the hoses separate, and the brake pipe becomes open to the atmosphere. The air pressure immediately begins falling without the engineer doing anything. Because a drop in brake pipe pressure is interpreted as a braking command, the separated portions of the train automatically apply their brakes. The rear section does not simply continue rolling away uncontrolled. The system is designed so that certain failures create a braking response instead of removing the ability to brake. This is known as a fail-safe principle. The system is arranged so that a loss of pressure tends to produce braking rather than a complete loss of braking. It is similar to a lock that moves into a secure position when something fails, instead of automatically opening. This design has protected railway operations for generations, but extreme cold introduces several complications. The locomotive compressor draws in ordinary outside air, and ordinary air always contains moisture. Under moderate conditions, that moisture can be removed or managed without major difficulty. At minus 45 degrees, however, water vapor and condensed moisture can freeze inside valves, pipes, reservoirs, and other parts of the pneumatic system. Tiny amounts of ice can gradually become serious restrictions. Frost can form inside passages, valves can become sluggish, and airflow can be reduced. At the same time, the rubber hoses connecting individual cars become hard and less flexible. Seals can lose their ability to maintain perfect contact, and small leaks can begin appearing where everything would remain tight during warmer weather. There is another complication that is even more difficult to notice. The braking command does not reach every car simultaneously. The pressure change moves through the brake pipe as a wave. The cars at the rear of a long train receive the command later than the cars near the locomotive. On a very long train, that timing difference matters. Extreme cold can make the situation more complicated because air may move less efficiently through partially restricted or leaking components. The result is not necessarily a dramatic failure. Instead, the system can gradually become less predictable. The engineer may still have brakes, but the exact response of the entire train becomes more difficult to anticipate. For someone controlling thousands of tons on a downhill grade, uncertainty is often more frightening than a visible mechanical failure. A broken component can be identified and repaired, but a system that still works while becoming less predictable creates a different kind of danger. The crew therefore spends much of the winter shift protecting the reserve of reliability before they actually need it. Condensation is regularly removed from the pneumatic system. The brake equipment is checked, and the line is tested before important sections of the route. Before a major descent, the crew performs a complete brake test. The engineer gives the command, another crew member checks the train, and the brakes must apply and release correctly along the required length of the consist. Cold weather can also influence how trains are operated. Depending on conditions and railway rules, train length, weight, speed, and operating procedures may be adjusted. A shorter consist can respond more predictably than an extremely long one, while lower speeds provide additional time and distance to react to unexpected conditions. None of this looks dramatic from the outside. There is no cinematic battle, and no spectacular rescue. It is simply a series of inspections and decisions. Yet those small actions can determine whether a winter shift ends normally or becomes an investigation into a serious incident. Tonight, the first brake test is successful. The train begins its first significant descent, and the brake equipment responds as expected. Afterward, the brakes release normally. The crew continues toward a siding where another freight train is expected to pass in the opposite direction. Much of the Alaska Railroad operates as a single-track system, meaning trains traveling in opposite directions need designated passing locations. A siding can therefore become a temporary waiting room in the middle of nowhere. The freight train stops, and the diesel continues idling exactly as it did before departure. The second major descent is still several hours away. For the moment, the most obvious technical challenge appears to be behind them. But the shift is entering another part of the job that rarely appears in glamorous descriptions of railway work: trying to sleep. It is around 1 in the morning. The train is stationary at a siding, waiting for the opposing movement to clear the line. The crew knows they will need to continue driving afterward, so they must use the waiting period to recover whatever energy they can. There is no comfortable bedroom hidden inside the locomotive. The engineer has a working seat. That is about it. One crew member reclines the seat as far as it allows, places a folded jacket or other clothing beneath his head, and tries to sleep while still wearing most of his work gear. The arrangement is temporary because the call to move can come at any moment. There is no guarantee that the crew will receive a long, uninterrupted rest period. They must be able to return immediately to their responsibilities when the train is cleared to continue. Even falling asleep in the cab is difficult. 3 major problems work against them: noise, vibration, and temperature. The diesel engine never truly becomes silent. Fans continue running, pumps operate, and the air compressor periodically starts with a heavy mechanical roar. That compressor is particularly ironic. The machine that repeatedly wakes the sleeping crew is also one of the devices protecting the train. It keeps replenishing air in the brake system. If the pneumatic system develops leaks because of the cold, the compressor may have to operate more frequently to maintain pressure. An experienced engineer can sometimes recognize the condition of the train simply from these sounds. If the compressor begins activating much more often than normal, it may indicate that the system is losing air faster than expected. In this environment, even the rhythm of a machine can become useful information. Then there is vibration. A running diesel engine transmits continuous mechanical movement through the locomotive. The seat shakes, the floor vibrates, and the entire cab feels alive. A person can eventually fall asleep because of exhaustion, but the rest may be shallow and fragmented. Temperature creates another problem. The cab does not have perfectly uniform heating. Warmth comes from the machinery and heating systems, while cold can enter through floors, doors, windows, and other surfaces exposed to the outside environment. The crew therefore exists between 2 extremes. One side of the body may feel warm while another remains cold. Heavy clothing becomes necessary, but too much clothing can make the heated cab uncomfortable. Ear protection may also be useful simply to make rest possible. But the 2 crew members do not sleep at the same time. One rests while the other remains responsible for the instruments, radio, and operating environment. After a period of time, they exchange roles. This is not really sleep in the normal sense. It is more like resting while keeping part of the brain connected to the machine. The experienced operator learns to separate ordinary locomotive noises from unusual sounds. The compressor, engine, fans, and vibration become part of the background, while an unexpected change can immediately attract attention. This explains why having 2 people in the cab remains valuable. Technically, modern locomotives contain many systems that can assist a single operator. But technology cannot completely replace another human who can look at the same instrument, hear the same sound, and challenge a decision made by someone who has been awake for too long. Eventually, the opposing train passes. The dispatcher clears the route, and the freight train begins moving again.
The night continues, and the second major descent approaches. Now it is around 4:30 in the morning. This is often one of the coldest periods of the entire night. The temperature can reach its minimum just before sunrise, while the human body is also operating at one of its lowest points of alertness. At this hour, fatigue becomes a serious factor. Reaction times can slow, concentration becomes harder to maintain, and the temptation to close your eyes becomes stronger. The crew has already been working for hours, and the second descent is less than an hour away.
Then the assistant notices something unusual. The brake pipe pressure is lower than expected, and instead of remaining stable, it is slowly continuing to fall. There is no explosion. No loud alarm announces the problem. The number on the gauge is simply not where it should be. Somewhere along the train, air is escaping. It could be a hardened hose, a valve that is not sealing correctly, a frozen connection, or another small leak created by the extreme temperature. The compressor starts more frequently, attempting to restore the lost pressure, but eventually it becomes clear that the compressor cannot compensate indefinitely. The cold has been working on the train for hours, and now the consequences are becoming visible.
The obvious decision is immediate. The crew cannot enter a major downhill section while the brake system is behaving unpredictably. They stop the train on relatively level track while sufficient pressure remains available for a controlled stop. This decision creates another problem. The railway is largely single track. A stopped freight train can interfere with movements behind it and trains approaching from the opposite direction. Every delay affects the wider operating schedule. But schedule is not the priority anymore. Thousands of tons of freight cannot safely descend a long grade when the crew is uncertain about braking performance. A delay can be corrected. An uncontrolled descent may not be.
The railway is isolated, and outside assistance cannot simply appear in minutes. Replacement equipment may be far away. A specialized repair team could take time to reach the train. The decision, therefore, belongs to the people already sitting in that cab. This is also where automated safety systems become important. Modern locomotives can monitor the operator and require periodic confirmation that the person remains alert and responsive. If the operator fails to respond, the system can take action and initiate a controlled stop. But such automation has a very clear limit. It can recognize that the operator is not responding. It can help stop the train. It cannot decide why the brake pressure is falling, determine which component is responsible, or decide the best way to repair the problem in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. That decision still belongs to people. And this is one reason the second person in the cab matters. The purpose is not simply to have another person physically present. It is to provide another set of eyes and another judgment when fatigue is at its worst. A tired person can make an error without realizing it. Two tired people can question each other, compare observations, and catch a mistake before it becomes an incident. The crew decides not to approach the descent until the cause of the pressure loss is found and corrected. The dispatcher is informed by radio. The train remains secured while the crew begins the inspection. Now, the glamorous version of railway work disappears completely. There is no dramatic music and no heroic shortcut. There is only a sequence of procedures developed through decades of experience. One crew member leaves the warm cab carrying a flashlight. Outside, the temperature is around -45 degrees. He walks along the ballast beside the train, examining the connections between the freight cars one by one. The train is long, so this takes time. The darkness stretches in both directions, and the flashlight illuminates only a small section at a time. The crew member checks hoses, fittings, valves, and other components for evidence of escaping air. Extreme cold can actually reveal certain leaks because escaping moisture can create frost around the problem area. A small patch of ice or unusual frost may provide the clue the crew needs. But working outside for extended periods is dangerous. Gloves have to remain on.
Yet detailed mechanical work sometimes requires precision that thick gloves make difficult. The crew therefore works in short intervals, returning to warmth whenever necessary. Eventually, the leaking connection is located. The affected area is warmed, the connection is restored, and the pneumatic system is checked again. Any accumulated moisture is removed, and the brake line is properly purged. But finding the leak is not the end. The crew cannot simply say, "It looks good now," and continue down the mountain. The complete brake test must be repeated. The engineer applies the braking command. The assistant checks the train. Brake equipment must respond along the required length of the consist, and then the brakes must release correctly. Only when the entire system responds as expected can the train proceed. The dispatcher receives the updated information, and permission is given for the movement to continue. But the crew does not simply return to the speed they might have used under easier conditions.
The second descent is approached conservatively. The train moves at a controlled speed, maintaining additional margin because the weather and mechanical conditions are still severe. The timetable has become secondary. The most important objective is to preserve control. Looking back at the entire night, the operation has depended on several simple principles. The diesel engine remained running because keeping the machinery warm was more valuable than saving a relatively small amount of fuel. The brakes were tested before the major descent, instead of waiting until a problem appeared. When the brake pressure became questionable, the crew stopped on level ground, rather than gambling with thousands of tons on a downhill grade.
And the two people in the cab remained there, because human judgment is still important when the situation becomes uncertain. Winter railway operation is not about pushing a machine to its absolute limit. It is about maintaining a margin of safety. A delay can be recovered. A train that has lost control on a long downhill grade may not be recoverable. Finally, the darkness begins to fade. It is around 7:30 in the morning. Winter sunrise in Alaska is slow and weak. The sky gradually changes from black to gray, and the first hints of daylight reveal the surrounding landscape.
If you found this journey into the hidden world of extreme railway operations interesting, subscribe to the channel for more stories about machines and the people who keep them alive in places where nature seems determined to stop them. Because sometimes the most incredible engineering stories are not about the biggest machines. They are about the small details that prevent those machines from failing when there is absolutely no room for error.